Quick little follow-up on this morning's text. You may have noticed that there was what you might call a circumlocution in the explanation of what day was happening. You like that word, circumlocution? That's a good word. Take a long route home. When it said on the day after the day of preparation. Did you notice that? As it's introduced the discussion between the religious leaders and Pilate, the day after the day of preparation. What is the day of preparation?
The day before the Sabbath.
Okay, and why is it called the day of preparation?
You've got to cook before what you're going to eat the next day.
Okay, mostly cooking, but anything that needed to be done for the Sabbath, they would do on Friday. Remember, the Sabbath was Saturday, the last day of the week, the seventh day of the week, Sabbath and seventh. And everything had to be done before the Sabbath. Now, we could think of a day beginning at dawn, but the Jew didn't. They thought of a day beginning when? As the sun went down on Friday, as soon as the sun went down and the light was gone, to them it was Saturday. We think of that as Friday night. They think of that as Saturday. So we didn't discuss this morning, but one of the issues that Joseph of Arimathea faced was to get Jesus' body down off the cross, prepped, and put into the tomb before it got dark, because he had to finish working, and so that he wouldn't be working on the Sabbath. Then, ironically, of course, right, we have the religious leaders. What are they doing on the Sabbath? Well, they're out doing business, with Pilate to make sure that Jesus stays in his tomb. But commentators kind of scratch their head. They wonder why this circumlocution, whatever. Now I can't even say the word. That sounds like locutus. That sounds like my Star Trek's coming out or something. Somebody recognized the word. Why use that a long way home? Why not just say on the Sabbath, the chief priests and so forth went and did their thing? Why say on the day after preparation?
They didn't want to bring attention to doing it on the Sabbath.
Well, it could be, but why not just say it's the Sabbath?
They don't want to muddy the Sabbath by talking about things like.
Matthew may have been thinking he didn't want to dishonor the Sabbath although he doesn't have a problem dishonoring telling the truth about those religious leaders. There's really nobody that I know of that's come up with a satisfactory answer that I have found. And so here's your opening, okay? You can answer a deep, scholarly, biblical question, write an article and get your name on it and be famous. Jamie, you can be the one who answers that question about Matthew chapter 27. Nobody else for 2,000 years has been able to answer. What's that? Yeah. One other thing, though, I wanted to point out to you. Jack and I have been having these discussions. He's bringing up, and all of you know, there's a couple of others that mentioned it too, that there are other things that are happening during this time that we read in Mark, Luke, and John, especially Luke and John, because Mark and Matthew are very, very close together. For instance, Matthew just sort of leaves the two who are crucified on either side of Jesus as criminals. But when we go and read Luke, we find out what?
Second robber repented.
That one of those on the cross repented and was saved right there in front of everybody on the cross as he talked to Jesus. But Matthew leaves that out. And there's a reason for that. I have a very strong conviction about teaching the Gospels, that when I teach Matthew, I want to teach Matthew. And a lot of preachers and teachers, instead of teaching the Gospel, they teach a harmony of the Gospels. Okay? And there's a difference between a harmony of the Gospels and a gospel. Okay? There's a time and place to teach and preach harmony of the Gospels. It's important for apologetic reasons to be able to answer questions. Well, John said this, and Luke said this, and Matthew said this. Well, if that's creating a barrier to faith, then somebody has to sit down and answer why. You know, is it possible to harmonize the Gospels and come up with one seamless story from beginning to end that takes into account everything that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote? And it is, and it's been done many, many times. There are still some questions. Some of those answers aren't satisfactory to everybody. But the point I'm making is that Matthew, as well as Mark, Luke, and John, were all led by God's Holy Spirit to be selective in the way that they each told the story. Just as my example this morning with going to Walmart. Certain things are left out and certain things are put in. There's a reason for that. And when you get up and teach a harmony of the Gospels, then you're no longer teaching the Gospel. You're no longer teaching what the Holy Spirit is saying through that one Gospel writer, whichever one you happen to be teaching. So that's just a little banner ad, especially for those of you who are Sunday school teachers. When you're teaching the Gospel, keep in mind that there are distinctions for a reason. And so we want to ask ourselves, like we're doing now as we go through Matthew, why did Matthew choose these particular circumstances to present and leave other things out? What is the point that he's trying to make? When I bring the other ones in, I've obscured what Matthew was trying to do, and I don't want to do that. Yes, ma'am?
On the preparation today, this kind of goes to what John said, because he said that, well, in the commentary, is that this particular preparation day was the day before the Passover feast day.
That's a possible answer. It wasn't a normal preparation day for a normal Sabbath. It was the Sabbath during the feast, the Passover feast. And I'm not sure if that's just a guess or if they have some scholarly information to back that up. It didn't exactly resound with me and make me feel like the whole thing had been answered when I read that. It sounds like they're still searching, looking for something. Okay, we ended up last week, I asked you a question about an Old Testament prophet who was upset with God because God was going to use a nation that was even more wicked than Israel to discipline Israel. The context of that is we were asking, can God use bad things to accomplish good ends? Can he use wicked people to accomplish good things? And I used this particular Old Testament prophet as an example, a clear example, of not only God doing that, but somebody complaining about it. One of the prophets complaining about it. Did anybody go find out which prophet I was talking about? Everybody forgot? I'm going to have to start passing out grades or something. The prophet in question is Habakkuk. Habakkuk. Okay, and the answer is Habakkuk. And with Habakkuk, you also have to learn how to spell his name, too. I think it's 2 Ks and 1 B. But anyway, Habakkuk lived about the same time as Jeremiah. And if you recall, Jeremiah had this bad news for Israel that Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, was going to come and destroy Jerusalem and tear down the temple. And Habakkuk Jeremiah wasn't the only voice, although he sounded like a lone voice. There were others. Habakkuk lived about the same time. And when God told him to go out and reinforce Jeremiah and give the same message, he didn't like it. And he complained. He said, wait a minute, are you telling me that you're going to use Babylon to discipline Israel, that pagan nation? I mean, we've got our problems, but they are just way off the radar screen. And God said, yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do. And then after 70 years, I'm going to discipline them as well. So God is in charge of the nations, does as he decides to do with them. So some people might say, well, gosh, that just doesn't seem fair. You know, that God chose one nation and he's going to bless them, and everybody else is sort of left out in the cold. Does that make God a bigot? You know, is he think some people are worth more than others? But the answer to that question is no, because God chose Israel to be a blessing to all the other nations. And Israel certainly, although they were the apple of God's eye, as David would put it, that put them in a position to also be disciplined even more harshly in in many ways because God expected more out of them. They were the ones that were given the law. They were the ones that were given the prophecies. They were the ones that had the prophets. They had the truth. If anyone should have been leading the way spiritually, it should have been Israel because of all of the benefits that they had by being the chosen people. All right, we are in Revelation chapter 18. I mentioned to you this morning that I think this chapter, more than any other chapter in the book of Revelation, speaks to middle class / upper middle class North American Christians in the West, Western Christians in the beginning of the 21st century. This one really hits home. A lot of the book is, we understand it, it's helpful, it's inspiring, but it's written to Christians who are being physically persecuted. And we can't, just have to admit that we can't really connect with that, because we're not being physically persecuted. At worst, we may be ridiculed. We don't like that, but there's a big step from being ridiculed to being physically persecuted. And so this chapter, however, it presents a subject and a dynamic spiritually that comes closer to home. Let's read a little bit of it. Chapter 18, verse 1 says, after these things, this is John speaking, these things would be chapter 17, which included a vision. He was told that he was going to be shown the judgments of Babylon, the great prostitutes. You remember we're in the section of the book of Revelation, the end section, where we're comparing two women who are also presented as two cities. The prostitute is one woman who is presented as the city of Babylon, and the bride of Christ is the other woman who is presented as the new Jerusalem. So John got a picture of this prostitute. She's riding on a scarlet beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, which tells us that that's Satan, the beast, the Antichrist. And she's got all this gaudy dress on and blasphemous names. And she carries a golden cup that is filled with the blood of the saints. So it's an ugly picture, but we get the idea that there's some relationship, very close relationship between Babylon, the prostitute, and Satan and the beast. And it's not a stable relationship. It's one that will end in disaster. So after these things, he says, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was lit up from his glory. And he cried out in a powerful voice, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, and she has become a dwelling place of demons, and a prison of every unclean spirit, and a prison of every unclean bird, and a prison of every beast unclean and despised. Yeah, your English translation may use slightly different words in there. Haunt, I think some of our translators like to use, but phalake is almost always rendered as a prison cell. So here we start right out with the idea of Babylon already being destroyed. Of course, it's being spoken of in this visionary experience as if it's happened already, but we know that it's still something that is going to happen at the end of time. John is being given a visionary experience that is showing him the things that will take place in the future, but for him the vision is past tense. It's already happened when he reports it. So this city has fallen, and it becomes a haunt for wild animals. This is a picture that's brought up in the Old Testament. There are a lot of connections to the Old Testament in this chapter. That's true of every chapter of Revelation, but they're just all over the place in chapter 18. Throughout the Old Testament, we read of these cities that exalt themselves and that God humbles. Tyre, Sidon, Jerusalem even at times, Sodom and Gomorrah, Nineveh. The list is long. These cities, these nation states grow up, they turn into big empires, they get arrogant, they get spiritually corrupt, and then God comes in and strikes them down, and the whole thing starts over again. This is a pattern that's been happening over and over and over throughout human history. And Babylon, the book of Revelation, seems to be the last and ultimate expression of this pattern. that finally this one city-state, this nation, this world government will rise up, the last one, the largest one, the most powerful one of them all. But the same thing will happen to Babylon that happened to all of those who came before. And in the Old Testament, when a city is destroyed and it's abandoned, who moves in? Animals. You know, you go through an abandoned city, and you may find wild animals living in it. And so that's the picture here, is we have an abandoned city where there's nobody there any longer, so the animals come in and take over. But notice the spiritual element. This is not just a physical reality. It's abandoned, and it's turned into an unclean place. All these unclean animals and demons, first on the list, come in. Verse 3. He gives us a reason here. Because the wine of the wrath of her, Babylon's, sexual immoralities, all the nations drank. So notice all the nations here. We're not just talking about one city, Babylon on the Euphrates. We're talking about, it is a city, but it's a city that has control over all the nations. And this is what has happened throughout human history. A city will get powerful, a nation will get powerful, and they'll want to have an empire and be in control of all the other nations and cities. Rome was the empire at that time. And there have been multiple empires throughout human history. Verse 3, halfway through there, it says, "And the kings of the earth committed sexual immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth from literally the power, dunameos, the power of her sensuality or luxury." That word can go either way. Sensuality or luxury. Luxury can be a good thing, or it can be a bad thing. In this chapter, luxury is a bad thing. Luxury is a thing that leads people astray. So from the power of her luxury, sensuality, they got rich. Now here's the new group on the block. Did you notice who is it? Who's the new group on the block in verse 3 that we haven't heard from? The merchants. Okay? And they're going to get most of the attention in chapter 18. If you've looked ahead, you notice that chapter 18 is one of the most lengthy chapters in the book of Revelation. And a lot of it is going to focus on these merchants. We've talked a lot about the kings. We've talked about the prophets so far, but now we have a new group on the scene, and it's the merchants, verse 4. "And I heard another voice from heaven." So the angel is finished. The angel has made his proclamation, and it's sort of it's a heading that gives us an idea of where this chapter is going. Now this voice from heaven takes over in verse 4, and we're not told who it is, so we could probably guess that it is whom? The voice from heaven. Yeah, God, Jesus, probably God. It could be an angel, but this is probably going to be God speaking for most of this section through the middle of chapter. Mm-hmm. And it says, "My people," yeah. And that would seem to settle it. But sometimes angels speak as if they are gods. They speak in the first person as if they're God. So it doesn't absolutely settle it. But even if that's true, we're still hearing the words of God. So it doesn't change the way we listen to it. All right. So he says, as Haman just noted, "My people, come out from her, so that you do not share in her sins, and do not receive her plagues." Verse 5, "Because her sins have stacked up to the heaven, and God has remembered her wrong deeds, crimes, something of that nature there." Verse 6, "Give back to her what she has given." And then there's an interesting translation question there at verse 6. So let's just stop and back up just a little bit. "Come out." Verse 4, this is God speaking. "Come out, my people." My people, of course, are his people. And we are used to reading that phrase in the Old Testament as being Israel. And so we can very quickly get embroiled into the question here of the pre-tribulation rapture and whether or not this is an indication that only Israel is left to follow God and so forth and so on. And I don't mind discussing that, but I'd like to wait till we get a little bit further through the book of Revelation, and we'll probably end up spending a whole night talking about that. But there's some more clues in the book of Revelation we haven't gotten to yet that might inform us in that discussion. So this is a possible clue here in that it says my people. But there are a lot of others who would say that my people could very easily include Christians. And then we could debate that. But for tonight, let's just say that they are God's people. At this point, if they're Jews, Karen asked me earlier about Messianic Jews. At this point, if they're Jews, they're Messianic Jews because they're Christians. Whether or not there are non-ethnic Christians, we'll discuss that later. But he calls on them to come out. This is a strong connection to the Old Testament. God often calls for his people to come out of a particular place, a city. Who was the first one that you can think of in the Old Testament that was called to come out of a city? Actually, there's one before that. Abraham. And it was this city. If we take Babylon literally, which I kind of like to do, then this empire at the end of the age would be centralized on the Euphrates in modern day Iraq, where Babylon was, where the city was, Euphrates. It doesn't have to happen that way, but if so, then he's calling his people at that time to come out of the very city that he called Abraham to come out of. So leave that city behind, go to a place that I'll show you. You know the story. And then the next one, somebody said it was Lot. Lot was told to come out of where? Yeah. Let's stop and think about this for a minute, because this is instructive for us, especially in this Revelation chapter 18. Lot had a problem leaving. So, and we see how things turned out, and we think, Lot. What was your problem? But what was Lot's problem? I mean, he couldn't see the future. Why was he so hesitant? He was comfortable?
He didn't want to leave his
Possessions, comforts. I think you hit it. He was, I don't know how long he lived there, but he watched the spiritual condition of Sodom for long enough that he was. That's exactly. He got used to it. And apparently it didn't bother him enough to either do something about it or leave. And when God finally came in, the angel came in and said, look, this city's doomed. Come out of her, my people. And in this case, my people was Lot and his family. Lot and his family didn't want to come out. In fact, Lot's wife did what? I mean, she's like, that's my home. All my stuff's back there, And she turned around and looked, and that was the end for her. So, what's that? That was for private consumption, I guess. Yeah. So here's the struggle. Jesus talks a little bit about this too with his disciples right before he went to the cross. This relationship between God's people and the world. How did he frame it? You know this. I'm just not asking the question well. Jesus said, "We are in the world, but not of the world." All right, and let's face it, that is a difficult position to be in, because while we're in the world, we can very easily what? Become of the world. Now, there are some Christians who do a pretty good job of never becoming of the world. But in their attempts to never become of the world, they also are not really what? They're really not in the world. Right before we moved here, Karen and I had a couple of friends, a married couple, and we used to spend time together. And they had this bent, we would start talking about the book of Revelation, end time prophecy or whatever. And they would, their minds went to, storing water away up on the mountain and canned goods, making sure that we've got a vehicle that we can get out of town quick with and all that kind of stuff. Bo's smiling over there. You must have some friends that have had that same conversation before. Yeah. So, these are Christians who physically, they may be living in the world, but they've got their hand on the back door, and the car's out there loaded, and up there on a mountain somewhere is a bunch of water and canned goods, and they're just waiting for the first whiff of the end times, and they're out of here, buddy, they're gone. And that's not what Jesus is talking about when he says, come out of them. And that's certainly not what Jesus meant when he said that we were in the world, but not of the world. If Jesus wanted us to avoid completely the temptations of Babylon, wherever that might be, then he would have had us live like the Essenes. There was a group that were living out in the wilderness during the first century and before the first century. If you've read anything about the Dead Sea Scrolls, they are the community probably that owned the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're an example of a community that didn't agree spiritually with what was happening in Jerusalem and Israel, and so they said, we're done with it. And they just moved out into a camp, out into the wilderness, and had no interaction at all. If that's what Jesus wanted us to do, he would have told us to do that. He would have told us to live outside the city and just wait for people to come out and join us. But he put us in the city. Why? Yeah, it's a simple answer. We're here for a reason. We're here to be the influencer, not the one influenced. And there's the struggle. But we have God's Spirit, we have God's Word, we have one another, we have all the resources we need to be successful at this. But one of the things that makes American, Western, 21st century Christians vulnerable to the temptations of the world is what?
Too blessed. We're too blessed.
I would agree with that. She says we're too blessed, so we get comfortable. And then if God shows up and says it's time to leave this city, we may be like Lot and Lot's wife. Well, now wait a minute. Are you sure? Do we have a little bit more time? Because my show's about to come on, So that I would agree with that. What else?
They're not being transformed by the renewing of their mind, they're not being the word. I see this in my son. He just never feeds himself with anything from the word, it's all from the world.
That's a great answer. And I would expect Jamie to come up with an answer like that. The people that we're talking about are not, their mind is not being renewed. That is being transformed they're not being transformed by the renewing of their mind. They're not in the Word, reading the Word, I would say on a daily basis. I believe that you should be reading your Bible on a daily basis, even if it's just a verse or two. God can take that morsel and feed your soul for that day. But if you don't have just even that morsel each day, then we begin to drive. Good answer. What else?
I think culturally, we live in a place where we don't hurt anybody's feelings.
That is a fantastic answer. Jennifer said, culturally, we live in a place where we don't want to hurt anybody else's feelings. And frankly, this is one of the ways that Satan has shut the church down, because we don't want any conflict. We don't want anyone to put us down. We want to fit in. We want everyone to love us too. Our need for the world's love is one of the greatest things holding back the church today. We really need to be accepted by the world. We're cool. We can wear good clothes too. We can listen to good music too. All of that stuff we've got to prove to the world constantly that we're acceptable to them. But the fact is that the minute we mention Jesus, it doesn't matter how cool our garb is, it doesn't matter how cool our haircut is, it doesn't matter how cool our music is, it doesn't matter how fantastic our building is or how good our coffee is. When you say Jesus, there's a dividing line that comes in. So it's not all of that that's causing the world to have a hard time with us. It's Jesus that's causing the problem. And we can't let go of Jesus. We can't let go of Jesus. Good answer. What else? Kathleen started to say something.
Well, I was going to say, to be in the world, we still have to
Absolutely.
Yeah, but there's, we were talking about this today, to be who you're supposed to be, and to still stand for the gospel and walk as a Christian, but to be among others that aren't, not beat them up, but still stand firm. And it's a very hard balance.
It is. It is hard to be in the world, but not of the world.
It's to be a Daniel.
Hmm?
To be a Daniel.
To be a Daniel, absolutely. And we've talked in here about how Daniel probably is going to inform our faith more and more as we go along than David. Because we're not living in a country that is influenced by the Christian community like it once was. Our country is now influenced, our culture and our society is influenced more by what we would call pagan ideas. And so Daniel is a resource for us to understand what does it mean to live in a pagan nation and to hang on to the faith.
They even look at, change their names to, pagan
Yeah.
name.
Yeah, does anybody, yeah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had Hebrew names. They had Hebrew names, yeah, absolutely. So it's a difficult thing, but God's called us to this. This is what we're called to. And the simple question, over the years as I've dealt with, especially young people, youth and college age, is they ask the question, how do I know what I can do to be in the world? I remember one gentleman that, a good friend of mine, his name is Robin. I told you before, Robin's the friend of mine who had a cat who wouldn't eat ice cream unless you spoon-fed it to him. That tells you anything about Robin. But Robin started a Bible study in a place called the Flying Tomato. It was a pizza joint out on the street where everybody hung out where we did street evangelism. And I would occasionally attend the Bible study just to see how they were doing. And one time I attended and he was smoking. And I knew he was trying to quit smoking. So I asked Robin, I said, why did you start smoking? And why are you smoking at the Bible study? Now, nobody in the room would have noticed it because this is a giant pizza joint, just loud, filled with kids, and about 80% of people in there were smoking. So he blended in. And that was his answer. He said, well, I'm just trying to blend in. I said, you don't have to do that. You know, you're here. You want to show some kind of difference. You're in a place where everybody's drinking and picking each other up and buying drugs. You're there at that table and everybody's got their Bibles open and you're talking Bible. That's what you need to be doing. And so those kinds of questions come up quite often. That one was fairly easy for me to answer. Sometimes they're not as easy to answer. But we want to make sure we know where the line is. And my answer has always been to young people is ask yourself this one question. In the relationship that you're thinking about, who is the influencer? Are you influencing that other person or group to change, or are they influencing you to change? And if the answer is that they're influencing you to change, then you need to extract yourself from that group, at least for now, because you're not strong enough to be there.
It has to be an individual thing, just different circumstances. It's different for each individual.
It is. Satan's very creative. You know, the minute we think we've got it all figured out, he's going to throw something down. And that's why we need to walk in the Spirit, because God's Holy Spirit can always inform us, given a new set of circumstances, how we need to adjust and move forward in our relationship with the world, so that we can express the love of Christ in a way that doesn't water it down, but doesn't become harsh and cruel either. Now, the answer that I would give to that question, all of your answers are very good, and I would agree with them 100%. But what I see as a pastor and someone who's been in ministry vocationally for over 2 decades is that we have a culture that doesn't agree with or understand the importance of the church. Doesn't understand the importance of having relationships with other believers. Close relationships with other believers where you hold yourself accountable. You hold yourself accountable. Now, for me, as your pastor, the person that you're paying to do this job, it's very easy for me to think of myself as being accountable to you. It's very easy for me during the week, as I think about doing this or that thing, to ask myself, who will see me doing this? And do I want them to see me doing that? Is that something that I should be seen doing? And I wonder, though, how often the person in the pew, you ask yourself that question, because you're not getting paid to be here. And if you step out of line, you're not going to lose your job. You might not be comfortable going back to that church anymore. So it may not seem like there's as much at stake, but there is. There is. Whether we realize it or not, that they used to, years ago, when you joined the church, you would either sign or agree to something called a covenant, a church covenant. You better remember that. I think they used to print it in the back of the hymnal, didn't they, Marilyn? And there was the idea of accountability to the church was more strong. People understood, I need a group that will encourage me and hold me accountable, and a group that will help me to grow strong enough that I can encourage others and hold other people accountable too. You're there when I need you, I'm there when you need me. So I see that there's been a loosening of that. You know, people they don't want to be held accountable in church. You know, a lot of people just want to come and have the church serve them. And if it gets a little uncomfortable in that church, then what are we going to do? Woo, we got about 50 churches in Camden, you know. You can go, it'll take you a while to get kicked out of every church in Camden, okay? You can pretty much make it through your prime time life getting kicked out of churches in Camden. So people just run to the next church. And the ministers, you know, we find ourselves in a position where we're in competition with one another, you know. So if somebody does something down the street at Collindale, and so they're not comfortable going to church there anymore, they come over here, and everybody just like, oh, it's okay, you know, we're glad you're here, you know, come on in. And, you know, oh, you want to join? Fantastic. It's like the past just doesn't exist because we're just trying to get as many people in here as possible. You know, those are some of the struggles that we face doing church in Camden or any American city with a lot of churches in it. That can be difficult, that don't necessarily promote a healthy church. In fact, they kind of promote an unhealthy church. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's just I feel like people in South America have commitment issues. Like they don't like to commit to anything because there is some accountability there.
Okay.
Like, if you look at everything and parents and church, you know, it's just, I think it comes down to we just don't want to be committed and tied down to anything.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Jennifer's pointing out that Americans don't like commitment, period. It's not just church. And so,
Sacrificial commitment.
yeah, sacrificial commitment. Any commitment that requires accountability, where somebody might say, you need to change, that's uncomfortable for us. And that lack of accountability is demonstrating itself in our family relationships because this generation now has decided that instead of getting married, we just move in and start having kids. That way, it's easier to go our separate ways if we do that. Accountability to institutions, to jobs, to careers, to professions, to family, to church, all of it has gotten weaker. And so we're weaker as a culture and society, and it has affected the church. And again, chapter 18 speaks to us because when does that happen the most? When everybody feels what? Come, I don't need you. You know, you can be here today, gone tomorrow. I'll just go over in this other group because there's wealth and opportunity everywhere. Now we can complain about recessions, but all of you who have been out of the country know how foolish that is. You know, my first, I'd seen it, but everybody here will agree with me that until you go there, you really don't know what it smells like. And there's a difference between seeing a picture and smelling what a place is really like. And I remember the first time that we went to a gypsy camp outside of Thessaloniki, Greece. It took my breath away. I couldn't believe that people on planet Earth live like that. You know, literally taking corrugated metal and wood and cardboard and piecing together some sort of covering that they and their children live in. And then there's a sort of group of these coverings around an open yard and a common water hose from 100 feet away from some source of water that they're robbing, that just stays running in the middle of the compound all the time. That's everybody's water who lives in that compound, and on it goes. So recessions here, the ups and downs of people do struggle. I don't want to trivialize people's struggles, but let's face it, we're surrounded by abundance. And abundance tends to make us soft spiritually. People talk about the great generation, the greatest generation, the generation that fought and won World War II. It was a generation that had some more spiritual steel to them because they had to give up their wealth and their riches, and many of them had to give up their sons and daughters at places all over the world. It made them a different group. This is something that's always bothered me. We, in our sinful condition, just for some reason, we can't handle wealth. It corrupts us. We tend to do better when we're squeezed. That's not everybody. Those are very general statements. They're not true in every case. But Revelation 18 is showing us that there comes a time to get out, and we need to be ready to get out. What if God were to come to you tonight? Let's just finish with this tonight, and we'll pick up next time in Revelation chapter 18. What if God were to come to you tonight in a vision and tell you that it's time to get out? Pack up what you can carry and leave. This is it. What would you do? Abraham's story causes us to ask that question. Lot's story causes us to ask that question. But we can think, those are things that happened in the past that won't happen anymore. But what this is telling us, Revelation chapter 18, is it will happen. It is going to happen. There will come a time when God will call on his people and say, come out of her, so that you don't share in her sins. So the question for me when I think about that is, am I too embedded in the luxuries of this world? Am I too anchored to the luxuries? Is my identity too connected to the luxuries of this world? Or if God were to call me to do so, would I be able to walk away from it and still be me and still be who I am? If I'm in Christ, then the answer is yes. To the degree that I'm not, then I'm going to struggle with that. Let's pray.